Ever wonder who's really pulling the strings behind the world's biggest events? Well, buckle up, because Lord Rothschild just dropped a bombshell that'll make your head spin. He says his family straight up created Israel. Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking secret meetings, backroom deals, and a plan so wild it shaped the entire Middle East. This ain't your grandma's history lesson. It's a peek behind the curtain that'll have you questioning everything you thought you knew about how countries are born. Who are the Rothschilds? Ever heard of a family so rich they could buy entire countries? That's the Rothschilds for you. These guys ain't your average millionaires. We're talking about a dynasty that's been pulling strings in the world's biggest banks for centuries. But here's the crazy part. Most people don't even know half of what these folks are really up to. The Rothschild story kicks off way back in the 1760s when Meyer Amschel Rothschild started a little banking business in Frankfurt, Germany. But that was just the beginning. This family didn't just stick to counting coins, they turned that bank into a global empire that's still going strong today. You think your rich uncle's mansion is fancy? The Rothschilds got homes that'll make your jaw drop. We're talking about castles, palaces, and estates spread out all over the world. They got a place in England called Waddesdon Manor that looks like it's straight out of fairy tale, and that's just one of their cribs. These folks got property worth billions in London, Paris, and pretty much every other fancy city you can think of. But mansions are just the start. Back in the day, these guys were like the world's biggest loan sharks, except their clients were kings and countries. Need cash to fund a war? The Rothschilds got you covered. Want to build a railroad across Europe? They'll write the check. These folks were bankrolling some of the biggest projects in history, while most people were still trying to figure out how to use a fork. Now, you're probably wondering just how loaded these Rothschilds really are. Well, it's kinda hard to put a number on it because they're real secretive about their wealth, but some folks estimate their family fortune could be worth over $1 trillion. Yeah, you heard that right, trillion with a T. That's more money than some entire countries have. And it ain't just about the cash. The Rothschilds got their fingers in so many pies it'll make your head spin. They're into banking, mining, real estate, and pretty much any other business that makes serious money. They got offices and investments all over the globe, from New York to Hong Kong and everywhere in between. But here's the thing, all that money ain't nothing compared to the power they've got behind the scenes. We're talking about a family that's been rubbing elbows with presidents, prime ministers, and royalty for generations. They've got connections in places most of us don't even know exist. So next time you hear about some big world event going down, just remember, there might be a Rothschild pulling the strings somewhere in the background. These folks ain't just rich, they're playing a whole different game than the rest of us. Lord Rothschild's bombshell claim. You thought the Rothschilds were just about money and power. Think again. Lord Rothschild just made a claim so bold, it's got everyone from historians to world leaders freaking out. What could this secretive family have done that's bigger than all their wealth combined? So here's the deal. Lord Jacob Rothschild, the big boss of the family, straight up said his family created Israel. Yeah, you heard that right. This ain't some conspiracy theory from a random dude on the internet. It's coming from the man himself, the head of one of the most powerful families in the world. Now you gotta understand, the Rothschilds ain't usually the type to go blabbing about their business. They've been keeping things on the down low for centuries. But for some reason, Lord Rothschild decided to spill the beans, and it's got everyone wondering why now. He dropped this bombshell in an interview, and it wasn't just a casual comment. He went into detail about how his family was involved in creating the Balfour Declaration. That's the document from 1917 that pretty much laid the groundwork for Israel to become a country. But here's where it gets real interesting. Lord Rothschild didn't just say his family supported Israel, he said they created it. That's a whole different level of involvement. We're talking about a family that supposedly had enough power to make an entire country happen. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Rich people do big things all the time. But this is different. We're talking about reshaping the entire map of the Middle East. That's not something you do with just a fat wallet. It takes serious political clout and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. And that's exactly what Lord Rothschild is hinting at. He's saying his family wasn't just throwing money around. They were in the room where it happened, making deals and influencing world leaders to make Israel a reality. But here's the million-dollar question. Why is he talking about this now? The Rothschilds have been tight-lipped about their influence for generations. So what's changed? Some folks think it's a power move, showing the world they're still pulling strings. Others reckon it might be about legacy, making sure the family gets credit for their biggest achievement. Whatever the reason, this revelation is shaking up how we think about modern history. It's not every day you hear that a single family had such a massive impact on world events. And coming from Lord Rothschild himself, it's hard to brush off as just another conspiracy theory. This claim is a big deal because it's coming from the top. Lord Rothschild ain't some distant cousin or minor player in the family. He's the main man, the one who's been steering the Rothschild ship for decades. When he talks, people listen. And this time, he's saying something that could rewrite history books. So next time you look at a map of the Middle East, remember this. According to one of the most powerful men in the world, that little country called Israel, it might just be the Rothschild family's greatest project. And who knows what other world-changing secrets this family's still keeping under wraps. The Balfour Declaration connection. Remember that map of the Middle East we just talked about? Well, there's one document that redrew those lines, and you'll never guess who was pulling the strings. The Balfour Declaration might sound boring, but trust me, it's got more drama than a season finale of your favorite show. So what's the big deal about this Balfour Declaration? It's basically the birth certificate of Israel. We're talking about a letter from 1917 that changed everything. The British government sent it to Baron Walter Rothschild, and it promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Yeah, you heard that right. A whole country, just like that. But here's where it gets wild. This wasn't just some random letter. The Rothschilds were deep in this from the start. Baron Walter Rothschild wasn't just the guy who got the letter. He was one of the big players making it happen. The family had been supporting Jewish settlements in Palestine for years, and now they had the British government backing them up. The declaration was only 67 words long, but those words packed a punch. It said the British government would use their best endeavors to set up this national home. That's politician speak for, we're gonna make this happen. And who was right there, working behind the scenes? The Rothschilds. Now, you might be thinking, so what? It's just a letter. But this piece of paper changed the whole game in the Middle East. It was like dropping a bomb on the map. Suddenly, everyone was scrambling to figure out what this meant for the region. The Arabs weren't too happy about it, and the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. It was chaos. But for the Rothschilds and the Zionist movement, this was their golden ticket. They'd been dreaming of a Jewish homeland for years, and now they had official support from one of the most powerful countries in the world. It was like getting the keys to a brand new country. And that's where Lord Rothschild's bombshell claim comes in. When he says his family created Israel, he's not just talking about throwing money around. He's talking about this declaration, about being in the room where it happened. The Rothschilds weren't just supporters, they were architects. Think about it. A single family with enough influence to get a world power to basically promise them a country. That's next level power. It's like if your rich uncle didn't just buy you a car, but built you an entire city to drive it in. But here's the kicker. The Balfour Declaration? That's just the tip of the iceberg. It's like the trailer for a blockbuster movie. The real action was still to come. The Rothschilds didn't just help create the idea of Israel. They were there every step of the way, from this declaration all the way to Israel becoming a real country. So next time someone tells you it's just a boring history lesson, you tell them this. The Balfour Declaration wasn't just a letter. It was the Rothschild family's first big move in creating a whole new country. And trust me, they were just getting started. Secret meetings and backroom deals. Ever wonder how countries really get made? It ain't like baking a cake. The birth of Israel took some serious behind-the-scenes action, and the Rothschilds were right in the thick of it. We're talking meetings so secret they make Area 51 look like a public park. These weren't your average business lunches. The Rothschilds were rubbing elbows with the big shots, British politicians, Zionist leaders, and anyone else who had a stake in creating a new country. They weren't just talking, they were making deals that would change the map forever. Imagine a room in London, filled with cigar smoke and whispered conversations. That's where the real action was happening. The Rothschilds would host these hush-hush gatherings in their fancy mansions, away from prying eyes. They'd wine and dine the most powerful people in the world, all while plotting the future of the Middle East. But it wasn't just London. The Rothschilds had their fingers in pies all over the place. They were pulling strings in Paris, whispering in ears in Washington, D.C., and making moves in Tel Aviv. These guys had a global network that would make modern social media look like child's play. And the decisions they were making, they weren't just talking about where to put a new Starbucks. We're talking about carving up territories, deciding on borders, and figuring out who gets what piece of the pie. The Rothschilds were like the ultimate party planners, except instead of planning a birthday bash, they were planning the birth of a nation. One of the big things they hammered out in these secret meetings was how to deal with the Arabs living in Palestine. It wasn't like the place was empty, you know, so they had to figure out how to make room for a new Jewish state without causing too much trouble. Spoiler alert, it didn't exactly go smoothly. They also talked about how to get other countries on board with the idea of Israel. The Rothschilds used their connections to lobby governments, sway public opinion, and basically sell the world on the idea of a Jewish homeland. They were like the Don Draper of nation building, crafting the perfect pitch for a brand new country. But here's the million-dollar question, or maybe the billion-dollar question when we're talking about the Rothschilds. How much did money influence these talks? 'Cause let's be real, the Rothschilds ain't exactly short on cash. Some folks say they were basically buying a country, using their wealth to grease the wheels and make things happen. Others argue it wasn't just about the money. The Rothschilds had something even more valuable than cash: influence. They could get anyone to pick up the phone, from the British Prime Minister to the US President. And in those days, before email and Twitter, that kind of access was worth its weight in gold. So next time you look at a map and see Israel, remember this: it didn't just appear out of thin air. It was born in smoky rooms and secret meetings, with the Rothschilds pulling the strings like master puppeteers. They might not have fired a single shot, but make no mistake, the Rothschilds were the real architects of Israel. The Rothschilds' financial support. Building a country ain't cheap. The Rothschilds knew it, and they opened their wallets wide. We're talking sums that make Jeff Bezos look like he's shopping at the dollar store. When it came to creating Israel, these guys weren't just throwing pocket change around. They were pouring millions into making their dream a reality. So what exactly were the Rothschilds spending all this cash on? First up, land. They were buying huge chunks of Palestine like it was going out of style. We're talking prime real estate that would become the foundation of the new state. But they weren't just buying empty desert. The Rothschilds were smart. They were scooping up fertile farmland, water sources, and strategic locations. But land was just the start. The Rothschilds weren't about to let their new country be a bunch of empty fields. They funded entire Jewish settlements, complete with houses, schools, and synagogues. These weren't just little villages either. We're talking about well-planned communities that could support thousands of people. And 'cause you can't have a country without roads and power, the Rothschilds bankrolled major infrastructure projects too. They paid for highways to connect the settlements, power plants to keep the lights on, and water systems to make the desert bloom. It was like they were building a whole civilization from scratch. But here's where it gets real interesting. Some folks say the Rothschilds didn't stop at civilian stuff. There's talk that they even helped fund the Israeli military in its early days. We're talking about buying weapons, training soldiers, and maybe even some top-secret tech. Of course, nobody's got the receipts for this kind of thing, but if it's true, it means the Rothschilds weren't just building a country, they were arming it too. Now you're probably wondering just how much cash we're talking about here. Well, that's where things get tricky. The Rothschilds aren't exactly the type to post their bank statements online, but some experts reckon they might have pumped billions into creating Israel. And that's in old-timey money. Adjust for inflation, and we could be talking about tens of billions in today's cash. But here's the thing, all this money stuff was kept super hush-hush. The Rothschilds weren't out there bragging about how much they were spending. They kept it on the down low, working through front companies and quiet donations. It was like they were trying to build a country without anyone noticing the price tag. So why all the secrecy? Well, creating a new country ain't exactly something you want to advertise, especially when there's already people living there. Plus, the Rothschilds probably didn't want other countries getting nervous about how much influence they had. It's one thing to be rich, but it's another to be country creating rich. But even with all that cash, money was just part of the story. 'Cause you can't just buy a country off the shelf, no matter how loaded you are. The Rothschilds had something even more valuable than money. They had connections. And that's where things get really interesting. Political influence in Britain and beyond. Money talks, but connections whisper. And the Rothschilds? They had a direct line to the most powerful ears in the world. We're talking prime ministers, presidents, and puppet masters pulling strings behind the scenes. But how deep did this influence really go? Back in the day, Britain was the big dog on the world stage. They had colonies all over the place, including Palestine. So if you wanted to make something happen in the Middle East, you had to get the Brits on board. And guess who had the British government on speed dial? Yep, the Rothschilds. These guys weren't just rich, they were kingmakers. They had members of parliament in their back pocket and could get a meeting with the prime minister faster than you can say cup of tea. The family was tight with British leaders like David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. We're talking fancy dinners, private meetings, and probably a few cigars shared in secret. But the Rothschilds didn't stop at Britain. Their network stretched all the way across the pond to the White House. They had connections with American presidents and big shots in Washington. It's like they had a VIP pass to every important office in the Western world. So how did all this political juice translate into support for a Jewish state? Well, the Rothschilds used their influence to keep the idea of Israel on the agenda. They made sure the right people were talking about it in parliament, in the press, and in private meetings. They were like the world's best PR team, but for a whole country. When it came time to make big decisions about Palestine, you can bet the Rothschilds were involved. They weren't just lobbying, they were shaping policy. Some folks say they even helped draft important documents like the Balfour Declaration. It's like they were writing the script for how the Middle East would look in the 20th century. But here's the thing, not everyone was happy about this. The Arabs living in Palestine weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of a Jewish state on their land. And some British politicians thought the Rothschilds had way too much influence. They were worried about a single family having so much power over foreign policy. There were protests and angry speeches in Parliament. Some people accused the Rothschilds of using their money to buy political favor. Others said they were putting British interests second to their own goals. It was like a political firestorm, with the Rothschilds right at the center. But despite all the drama, the plan for Israel kept moving forward. The Rothschilds and their allies knew how to weather a storm. They kept working behind the scenes, using their connections to smooth over problems and push their agenda, opposition and controversy. While the Rothschilds were busy pulling strings, not everyone was cool with their grand plan. Creating a whole new country? Yeah, that's gonna ruffle some feathers, and we're not just talking about a few angry tweets. This was next-level drama that threatened to derail the entire Israel project. First up, the Arab leaders were straight up furious. They saw the Balfour Declaration as a massive betrayal. These guys thought they were gonna get their own countries after World War I, but instead, they're watching the Brits and the Rothschilds carve up their land. Arab politicians were giving fiery speeches, writing angry letters, and basically telling everyone who'd listen that this whole Israel thing was a bad idea. But it wasn't just the Arabs causing trouble. Some British politicians were getting real nervous about how much pull the Rothschilds had. They were like, hold up, are we letting one super-rich family decide our foreign policy? There were debates in Parliament where politicians accused the government of being in the Rothschilds' pocket. It was like a political soap opera, but with way higher stakes. And on the ground in Palestine, things were getting real messy. We're talking protests, riots, and straight-up violence. Jewish settlers were moving in, buying up land, and the local Arabs weren't having it. There were clashes in the streets, attacks on settlements, and the British police were struggling to keep the peace. It was like a powder keg, just waiting to blow. The Rothschilds and their Zionist allies had to deal with all this pushback. They weren't about to let their dream of Israel go up in smoke, so they got clever. They pumped more money into PR campaigns, trying to win over public opinion. They worked their political connections over time, smooth-talking politicians and diplomats to keep the plan on track. They also tried to sweeten the deal for the Arabs, promising economic development and cooperation. But let's be real, that was like offering a band-aid for a broken leg. The Arabs saw right through it and kept on fighting. Despite all the drama, the Rothschilds and their crew kept pushing forward. They were playing the long game, figuring if they could just hold on long enough, they'd get their country. And you know what? They were right. The opposition couldn't stop the momentum. The League of Nations gave Britain the mandate over Palestine, basically giving the green light for a Jewish homeland. More Jewish immigrants kept pouring in, building up the foundations of a future state. The Rothschilds kept bankrolling the whole operation, making sure their dream stayed alive. In the end, all the protests, debates, and violence couldn't stop Israel from becoming a reality. The Rothschilds and their allies had too much money, too much influence, and too much determination. They weathered the storm of opposition and came out on top. It just goes to show, when you've got deep pockets and friends in high places, you can make almost anything happen, even a whole new country. The UN partition plan. Just when you thought the Rothschilds couldn't get any more ambitious, they decided to play chess with the entire Middle East. The UN partition plan of 1947 was supposed to be a fair solution, but was it really, or just another Rothschild power play? So here's the deal. By 1947, the situation in Palestine was a mess. The British were like, "We're out of here," and dumped the whole problem on the UN. The UN came up with this plan to split Palestine into two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. The plan was like trying to cut a pizza with your eyes closed. It gave the Jews about 55% of the land, even though they were only about a third of the population. The Arabs were supposed to get 45%, and Jerusalem, that was gonna be an international zone, 'cause nothing says peace like splitting a holy city, right? Now here's where it gets juicy. The plan passed in the UN General Assembly, but barely. We're talking 33 votes for, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. That's closer than a Kardashian's Instagram filter. And some folks reckon the Rothschilds were behind the scenes, pulling strings like puppet masters. See, the Rothschilds had connections all over the world. They weren't just rich. They had the ears of presidents and prime ministers. Some say they were working overtime, calling in favors, and maybe even throwing some cash around to swing those votes. It's like they were playing a real-life game of Risk, but with actual countries. The Jews were mostly happy with the plan. I mean, they were getting their own state after centuries of dreaming about it. But the Arabs, they were furious. They saw it as a total rip-off and refused to accept it. It's like if someone came into your house and said, "Hey, I'm taking half your rooms now, cool?" As soon as the plan was approved, all hell broke loose. We're talking violent protests, attacks on Jewish settlements, the whole 9 yards. The British were still in charge for a few more months, but they were basically watching from the sidelines as everything went crazy. The Rothschilds and their Zionist buddies were probably popping champagne, thinking they'd won the game. But this was just the beginning, because while they might have gotten their plan through the UN, actually making it happen on the ground was a whole other story. So what happened next? Well, that's when things really heated up. The Arabs weren't about to just hand over half the country, and the Jews weren't gonna back down after coming so close to their dream. It was like two kids fighting over the last piece of candy, but with tanks and guns. In the end, the UN partition plan might have looked good on paper, but in reality, it was just the starting gun for a whole new level of conflict. The Rothschilds might have thought they'd scored a win, but they were about to find out that creating a country is a lot messier than just drawing lines on a map. Israel's Declaration of Independence. Remember how messy things got after the UN vote? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the day Israel actually became a country. May 14th, 1948. Sounds like just another date, right? Wrong. It's the day a 2000-year-old dream came true. Or did it? Picture this. Tel Aviv, a city buzzing with excitement. David Ben-Gurion, looking all official in his suit, stands up in front of a crowd. He starts reading this fancy document and boom, Israel is born. Just like that, a new country pops up on the map. But here's the thing. Was Ben-Gurion really the mastermind, or just the face of something much bigger? See, while Ben-Gurion was doing his thing in Tel Aviv, the Rothschilds were probably popping champagne somewhere fancy. These guys had been working on this for decades, and now they were watching their pet project come to life. It's like when you spend years building something in Minecraft and finally get to show it off. But the Rothschilds weren't just sitting back and watching. Nah, they were still pulling strings behind the scenes. Some folks say they helped write that declaration Ben-Gurion read out. Others reckon they were on the phone with world leaders, making sure Israel got recognized ASAP. And speaking of recognition, the US and Soviet Union didn't waste any time. They recognized Israel almost immediately. It's like they were waiting by the phone, ready to hit that like button as soon as Israel went live. But you gotta wonder, did the Rothschilds have anything to do with that quick response? Back in Tel Aviv, the celebrations were wild. People dancing in the streets, waving flags, the whole 9 yards. But in some fancy office somewhere, you can bet the Rothschilds were having their own private party. This wasn't just a win for them, it was the jackpot. But here's the crazy part. Creating Israel was actually the easy bit. Keeping it alive? That was going to be a whole other battle. See, the Arab countries around Israel weren't too happy about this new neighbor. They were getting ready for a fight, and Israel was barely a day old. So while everyone was celebrating, the Rothschilds were probably already planning their next move. They knew they'd need more than just fancy declarations to keep their new country safe. We're talking weapons, soldiers, alliances, all the stuff you need when you're the new kid on the block and everyone wants to pick a fight. In the end, May 14th, 1948 wasn't just the birth of a country, it was the day the Rothschilds saw their biggest investment pay off. But like any smart investor, they knew the work was far from over. The game was just beginning, and these guys were playing for keeps. Supporting the new state, the Rothschilds didn't just create Israel and peace out. Nah, they stuck around to make sure their new country didn't fall apart. And let me tell you, Israel needed all the help it could get. The place was surrounded by angry neighbors, had barely any infrastructure, and was broke as a joke. But the Rothschilds, they were ready to play sugar daddy. First up, they dumped millions into Israel's economy. We're talking serious cash here. They built factories, set up banks, and invested in agriculture. The Rothschilds weren't just throwing money around though. They were smart about it, focusing on industries that would make Israel self-sufficient. They knew a country that can't feed itself ain't gonna last long. But that's nothing compared to how they used their connections. The Rothschilds had friends in high places all over the world. They were calling up presidents, prime ministers, and business bigwigs, telling them to give Israel a chance. It's like they were running a global PR campaign for a whole country. And it worked. Israel started getting recognition, trade deals, and diplomatic support from countries that mattered. Now here's where it gets real interesting. Some folks say the Rothschilds went beyond just economic and diplomatic support. They reckon the family helped Israel get its hands on some serious military tech. We're talking cutting-edge weapons systems, intelligence gear, maybe even stuff to help with Israel's not-so-secret nuclear program. Of course, nobody's got hard proof of this, but 'cause it's the Rothschilds, people love to speculate. All this support wasn't just charity, though. The Rothschilds wanted influence, and they got it. They had the ear of Israel's top leaders and a say in big decisions. It's like they were the unofficial royal family of Israel, pulling strings from behind the scenes. Their support helped Israel survive those tough early years. When Arab armies attacked right after independence, Israel was ready. They had weapons, trained soldiers, and international backing. The Rothschilds' investments meant Israel's economy didn't collapse under the strain of war. And their diplomatic connections? Those helped make sure Israel didn't get isolated on the world stage. But here's the thing. All this help came with strings attached. The Rothschilds weren't just being nice. They wanted to shape Israel into their vision of what a Jewish state should be. They had ideas about everything from economic policy to how religious the country should be. And 'cause they were bankrolling so much, Israeli leaders had to listen. Some Israelis weren't too happy about this. They felt like their new country was being controlled by a rich family from halfway across the world. But others saw the Rothschilds as saviors, the only reason Israel managed to survive those early years. The Rothschild legacy in modern Israel, fast forward to today, and you'd be forgiven for thinking the Rothschilds were just a footnote in Israel's history. But here's the thing. Their mark on the country ain't faded one bit. It's just gone from in-your-face to sneaky subtle. The Rothschilds might not be all over the news these days, but their fingerprints are all over Israel. They still own some of the fanciest real estate in the country. We're talking prime spots in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other major cities. The family's got properties worth millions, maybe even billions. But that's nothing compared to how they've left their mark on Israel's streets and buildings. Take Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv. It ain't just any old street. It's one of the main drags in the city. Fancy cafes, trendy startups, and some of the most expensive apartments in Israel line this road. And guess who it's named after? Yep, the Rothschilds. The family's name is plastered all over the place. They've got hospitals named after them, like the Rothschild Hospital in Haifa. There are Rothschild museums showing off the family's art collections. Even some government buildings carry the Rothschild name. It's like they've got a piece of every part of Israeli life. But the Rothschild influence goes way deeper than just names on buildings. They're still major players in Israel's economy. The family's got investments in tech startups, real estate developments, and big corporations. Some folks say they even have a say in major economic decisions, working behind the scenes with government bigwigs. And let's not forget about their political pull. The Rothschilds might not be out there running for office, but they've still got connections in high places. They rub elbows with Israel's top politicians at fancy dinners and charity events. Some people reckon they're still pulling strings, just like they did back in the day. But here's where things get interesting. All this influence is starting to raise some eyebrows. People are asking questions about how much power one family should have over a whole country. There's talk about the Rothschilds having too much control over Israel's future. Some Israelis are proud of the Rothschild connection, seeing it as a link to their country's founding. Others ain't so sure. They worry about a rich foreign family having so much say in Israeli affairs. It's like a debate that's been going on for decades, and it ain't stopping anytime soon. Criticisms and conspiracy theories. Now, you might think we've covered all there is to know about the Rothschilds and Israel, but what if I told you there's a whole other side to this story? One that's got people whispering about secret underground bunkers and world domination plans. See, not everyone's buying the official story about the Rothschilds and Israel. Some folks think this connection goes way deeper than what we've talked about. They reckon the Rothschilds ain't just supporters of Israel. They're the ones really running the show. These conspiracy theories are wild. Some people say the Rothschilds secretly control Israel's government and economy. They think the family's pulling strings behind the scenes, telling Israeli leaders what to do. It's like they see the Rothschilds as puppet masters, with Israel as their favorite toy. But that's nothing compared to the folks who think Israel's just a part of the Rothschilds' plan for world domination. Yeah, you heard that right. These theorists reckon the family's using Israel as a base to control the whole Middle East and eventually the entire world. It's like something out of a movie, but people actually believe this stuff. And it gets even crazier. There's talk about underground bunkers hidden all over Israel. Some say these are secret Rothschild hideouts filled with gold and high-tech gadgets. Others think they're part of some doomsday plan. It's like people think the Rothschilds are preparing for the end of the world or something. Then there's all the chatter about secret societies. Some folks reckon the Rothschilds are part of groups like the Illuminati or the Freemasons. They think these societies are the ones really running things, with Israel as their home base. It's like they see the whole country as one big secret clubhouse. But here's the thing. Separating fact from fiction ain't easy when it comes to the Rothschilds. We know they've got money and influence. We know they played a big role in creating Israel. But all this other stuff, there's no real proof. The truth is, the Rothschilds' influence in Israel is probably somewhere between what they say and what the conspiracy theorists think. They've definitely got power, but they ain't running the whole show. Israel's a real country with its own leaders and problems, not just a Rothschild puppet.